Arthur's family truth. At the rehearsal dinner, my grandson leaned closer. "Grandpa, he's not who he says he is." I didn't react, I just set my glass down and kept looking at the table. But the way he said it, it didn't leave me. I kept looking at the table. Colton Reeves was across the room, talking like nothing was wrong. Everyone liked him. That was the problem. "My name is Arthur Hargrove. I'm 66 years old. I spent 40 years building a construction supply company out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and adding commercial real estate across Tennessee and Georgia along the way. My late wife and I set up the Hargrove Family Trust about 22 years ago. It's worth just over $90 million now. I'm not telling you that to sound impressive. I'm telling you because it's the reason Colton Reeves was sitting at that table in the first place. Claire is my granddaughter. She's 28. Works as a pediatric speech therapist in Nashville. Her mother, my daughter-in-law, passed away 3 years ago. After that, Claire went quiet for a long stretch. She kept working, kept calling on Sundays, but something in her had pulled back. Like she was waiting to feel safe again before she opened back up. So when she called me about 18 months ago on a Sunday evening with that particular brightness in her voice, I was genuinely glad for her. She had met someone. His name was Colton Reeves, 36 years old, a private equity advisor based in Atlanta. A colleague at the hospital had introduced them. Within 4 months, he had moved to Nashville to be closer to her. Everybody thought that was romantic. My son Russell said the guy was sharp. Claire's friends thought he was a catch. Claire herself looked happy in a way I hadn't seen since before her mother got sick. I watched him. That's something you learn after 40 years of contract negotiations and land deals. You let the other person fill the room, and you pay attention to what they reach for when nobody's looking. Colton talked a lot. He talked about his clients, couldn't name them. Of course, confidentiality and all that. He talked about deals always just about to close. He mentioned a penthouse in Dallas and a family ranch outside Chattanooga that had been in the Reeves family for generations. He had a way of saying all of it that made people lean toward him. But here's the thing, he never showed us anything. No business card with a real address. No photos of the ranch, nothing you could put your hands on. Just words and a very convincing way of delivering them. I didn't say anything to anyone. I had nothing solid, and Claire was doing better than she had in years, so I kept my mouth shut and kept watching. The first time I felt something genuinely wrong was Easter Sunday. This was about 8 months after Claire started seeing him. We were all at Russell's house in Knoxville, the whole family, the big dining table, kids running in the hallway, the kind of afternoon where everything feels fine. Colton had been easy and charming all day, helped clear plates, remembered everyone's names, asked the kids about school. All the right moves. I stepped out to the back porch for some air, and I heard him around the corner of the house on his phone. His voice was different. Tight, low, nothing like the way he talked at the table. "Give me 2 more months. Tell him I'm close." That was it. Then silence. Then he came back inside, poured himself some sweet tea, and picked right back up where he left off. I stood there on that porch for a minute before I went back in. I told myself it could be anything. A business deal under pressure. A client he was managing. I had no context for that call and I knew it. But I also knew what I had heard. And I knew the difference between a man who is stressed about a normal business problem and a man who is trying to buy time on something he doesn't want anyone to know about. I didn't say a word to Claire. I didn't say a word to Russell. I just filed it away and kept watching. 6 months after Easter, Claire called on a Sunday. I could hear it in her voice before she even said anything. That kind of brightness people carry when they've been sitting on news for days. "Grandpa," she said. "He asked me at the Fairmont last weekend. I told her I was happy for her. I meant it. I was also already thinking about the next step. I told her I wanted to sit down with Colton properly, just the 2 of us, before anything else moved forward. She said he would love that." We met the following Friday at a steakhouse on Market Square. Colton was already there when I arrived. On time, pressed shirt, firm handshake, looked me straight in the eye. He ordered the second cheapest wine on the list. Not the cheapest, because that looks cheap, not the most expensive. Because that looks like you're trying too hard. Right in the middle. A small calculated move that most people would never even notice. I noticed. We talked for a while about Claire, about Nashville, about what kind of life he wanted to build. He said the right things. He talked about wanting to be the kind of husband her father would respect, the kind of man who shows up. He talked about stability, about roots, about how much it meant to him that Claire had a family as close as ours. All of it sounded good. All of it felt rehearsed. Then, about 40 minutes in, he made his move. He did it the way skilled people do. He buried it in the middle of something else, kept his voice the same, didn't change his posture. "Claire's mentioned the trust a few times," he said. "The structure you set up. I've actually worked with clients navigating similar situations, beneficiary changes, generation skipping provisions, how to bring a new spouse into the picture cleanly before the marriage rather than after. It's smart planning, honestly. Protects everyone," he smiled. I smiled back. I said something like, "Good to know there are people who understand that stuff." And I changed the subject. But I heard exactly what he said. Generation skipping provisions. That is not dinner conversation. That is not something a man mentions casually when he's trying to make a good impression on his future wife's grandfather. That is something a man mentions when he has been thinking carefully about a $90 million trust and where he fits into it. On the drive home, I called Carol Ashford. She's handled the Hargrove Family Trust for 20 years. I didn't tell her why I was asking. I just asked her to remind me what it would take to add a beneficiary. She said it required my direct signature, 2 witnesses, and a notarized amendment filed with the trust. Nothing happens without me choosing to make it happen. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before I went inside. I want to be clear about how I started. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't do anything dramatic. I just did what I've always done when something about a deal feels off. I picked up the phone and called people I've known for years. First call was to Frederick Dunmore. He runs a commercial real estate operation out of Dallas, and I've done business with him for going on 15 years. I told him I had someone I was trying to get a read on, private equity guy. Claimed to have a penthouse in Dallas, said he moved in certain circles down there. I gave him Colton's full name and a few other details. Frederick called me back 2 days later. "Arthur," he said, "I've asked around. I talked to 4 people who would know this name if it meant anything in Dallas. Nobody's heard of him. Not in private equity, not in real estate, not anywhere close to it. If this man has a penthouse in Dallas, he's keeping it very quiet." I thanked him and kept going. Colton had mentioned the Reeves family ranch outside Chattanooga at least 4 or 5 times over the months I'd known him. Always in passing, always casual, like it was just a fact of his life, the way you mention a place you grew up. Old family land, generations of history. The kind of detail that tells people you come from somewhere solid and real. I called Norman Payne. He's a land title specialist I've used in Tennessee and Georgia for years. I asked him to run a search on any property connected to the Reeves name in Hamilton County and the surrounding area. He came back in 48 hours. Nothing. No Reeves family land in Hamilton County. Nothing in the adjacent counties either. The only result with that surname in the broader Chattanooga region was a residential lot in a subdivision that had sold 6 years ago, a standard house on a standard street. Nothing that matched what Colton had described in any way. 2 calls. 2 dead ends. Both on things Colton had mentioned like they were basic facts about his life. That's not a misunderstanding. That's not someone who got a detail wrong or exaggerated a little. When a man tells you about his family's ranch and his Dallas connections, and neither one exists, that's architecture. He built a version of himself out of details that sound real but can't be verified. And he built it specifically to be accepted by a family like mine. I still didn't say anything to Claire. I didn't say anything to Russell. I needed more. I needed something I could put on a table and point to. So I called Carol again. This time I told her why. I gave her everything I had. Colton's full name, the name of the firm he said he worked for in Atlanta, his stated credentials as a registered portfolio manager, his business address. I told her to dig as far as she needed to and to be discreet about it. She said she'd get back to me in 2 weeks. I went about my days, answered emails, took calls, had dinner with Russell on a Thursday and said nothing. Talked to Claire on Sunday and told her things were fine. I waited. Carol called me back on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks later. I was at my desk with coffee. She didn't lead with small talk, which told me she had found something worth skipping the small talk for. The firm Colton had named his employer, the company whose name was on everything he'd told us about himself, had been registered in Atlanta in 2018 and dissolved in 2020. It had failed to file its annual returns. 2 years of operation, then gone. The address he had listed as his current business address was a mail forwarding service in a Westmount-style office park. Not an office, a mailbox. His credentials were next. He had told us more than once that he was a registered portfolio manager. Carroll checked every securities database in Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida. His name did not appear in any of them. He had no license. He had no registration. He was not, and had never been, as far as anyone could find, a portfolio manager of any kind. I was taking notes while she talked. I had filled most of a page before she got to the last part. She had found a court record, a civil case, 3 years old, filed in Savannah, Georgia. A family named Aldridge had sued a man using the name Gerald Pruitt. According to the filing, this man had become romantically involved with their daughter, had gradually gained access to family financial documents, had convinced her to open a joint account for their future together, and had transferred a significant sum before ending the relationship and disappearing. The suit had been settled out of court with a confidentiality clause attached, but the record itself was still public. The family had submitted a photograph as part of their complaint. Carroll emailed it to me while we were still on the phone. I opened it. It was Colton Reeves. I sat there at my desk for a long moment. My coffee had gone cold. I hadn't touched it since she started talking. I'm not someone who panics. I've been through the recession of the early 90s when I nearly lost everything I'd spent a decade building. I've sat with my wife through diagnoses that changed everything. I know how to hold hard information steady while I figure out what to do with it. But looking at that photograph, knowing what I knew about Claire, about how much she had opened back up over the past 2 years, about how happy she had let herself become, what I felt was not panic. It was something closer to cold, quiet fear. Not for me. For her. By this point, the wedding had grown into something I barely recognized. What had started as a modest celebration for close family had been expanding for months. Each edition came from Colton, always framed around what Claire deserved, always proposed gently enough that by the time anyone thought to push back, the decision had already been made. A larger venue, a catering upgrade, a photographer flying in from out of state, additions to the lodge rental in Blue Ridge, Georgia, a place Claire had loved since she was a little girl, something about the river and the ridges. By the time Russell came to me, the budget had reached $260,000. He didn't go to Colton directly. He came to me instead, which meant he was hoping I would say something, which meant the whole family had been quietly waiting on me to act. I told Russell I was working on it. I didn't tell him what I had found, not yet. Then Eugene came to me on his own. He's 31. Claire's older brother works civil engineering in Knoxville. He's always been the quietest person in our family. The kind of man who notices things without making a show of noticing them. He had apparently been doing his own digging for weeks, found the same dissolved firm that Carroll had found, and kept pulling on the thread. Through a contact he wouldn't name to me, he had tracked down a woman in Austin, Texas. Her name was Dorothy Hensley. Over 2 years ago, she had been in a relationship with a man who called himself Howard Calloway. He had been in her life for 8 months. Toward the end, he had suggested they open a joint savings account for their future, he said. She had agreed. A few weeks later, he withdrew $58,000 and stopped returning her calls. Eugene had spoken to her on the phone the week before the rehearsal dinner. He told me she had cried. Not the kind of crying that's about being upset in the moment, the kind that comes when someone has been carrying something alone for a long time and finally someone calls. Eugene said to me, "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, Grandpa, but I'm sure." I looked at him for a moment. He looked back at me steady, the way he does. I put my hand on his arm and told him he had done exactly the right thing. I told him to go enjoy the rest of the evening and let me take it from there. So that brings us back to the rehearsal dinner. 40 people at long wooden tables inside the Blue Ridge Lodge, lantern light, cedar beams overhead. Somewhere below us in the dark, the river moving through the gorge. Claire at the far end of the table, laughing at something her friend had said, her whole face open. Colton was working the room, moving from group to group, easy and warm, the laugh always ready, the name always remembered. He was very good at it. I had been watching him do it for 2 years, and I still had to give him credit for how good he was. Eugene came and sat beside me after the main course. He leaned in close and kept his voice low. "Grandpa, he's lying." I set down my drink. I looked at the table for a second. Then I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked over to where Colton was standing with a glass of bourbon and a story that had the people around him laughing. I touched his shoulder. "You got a few minutes?" I said. "I could use some air." He smiled and said, "Of course." We walked out to the cedar railing at the far end of the terrace, below us, the river above us, the ridgeline dark against a clear sky. I let him get settled. Then I started talking. I told him I knew his firm in Atlanta didn't exist. I told him I knew there was no Reeves family ranch outside Chattanooga, that Norman Payne had searched every land record in Hamilton County and the counties around it, and the Reeves name wasn't on anything that matched what he'd described. I told him I knew about the civil case in Savannah. I told him I knew the name Gerald Prout. I told him that the photograph the Aldridge family submitted to the court was the same face I had been watching sit at my family's dinner table for the past 2 years. I told him I knew about Dorothy Hensley in Austin. I told him I knew about Howard Calloway, and I told him I knew about the $58,000 that disappeared the same week he did. I told him that Carol Ashford had already been in contact with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit and the Georgia State Attorney General's office, and that both were aware of what we had found. I said all of it evenly, no raised voice, no dramatics. Just one fact after another, the way you'd go through items on a contract. He stopped smiling about halfway through the first thing I said. By the time I finished, he was completely still. He was looking at me with a flat, measuring expression, not guilt, not fear exactly, just calculation. Like he was running numbers in his head, figuring out what the odds looked like from where he was standing. Then he said, "This is going to hurt her." I said, "Yes." "And that is entirely your doing." I told him he would not be at that lodge in the morning. I told him the wedding was not happening, and I told him that if he left quietly that night and never contacted Claire again, I would allow the federal process to move at its own pace without my family adding additional formal pressure on top of it. But if he stayed, or if he reached out to Claire in any way that caused her further harm, I would make sure that every alias, every court record, and every victim's account reached every law enforcement office in every state where he had operated. All of it, every piece. He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he set his drink down on the railing and walked back inside. He was gone before midnight. Claire got a text from him sometime around 11. It said he needed space and couldn't go through with it. No explanation beyond that. He just disappeared. The same way he had disappeared from Savannah, the same way he had disappeared from Austin. I stayed at the dinner until the last guests left. I talked to people. I helped carry things inside. I did not tell anyone what had happened on that terrace, not that night. Claire needed that night to be whatever it needed to be. Shock deserves its own quiet space. I drove up to the lodge the next morning. Claire was on the porch with a blanket pulled around her shoulders and a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. She was watching the river. Eugene was inside moving around the kitchen, making breakfast without being asked, the way he does. I sat down in the chair next to her. I told her everything. I went through it the same way I had gone through it with Colton the night before. One thing at a time. In order, I showed her what Carol had found. I pulled up the photograph from the Savannah case on my phone and let her look at it as long as she needed to. I told her about Dorothy Hensley and about what Dorothy had said when Eugene called. Claire didn't say anything for a long time. The river was loud that morning, running fast and full from the spring runoff, and the sound of it filled in the silence. Then she said, "How long did you know?" I told her the truth. I said I'd had a bad feeling since Easter, had started checking in earnest after the engagement dinner on Market Square, and had been certain for about 3 weeks before the rehearsal dinner. She asked why I hadn't told her sooner. I told her that going to her without proof would have only pushed her closer to him. A man like Colton counts on that. He counts on the people around his target looking like the problem while he looks like the solution. I needed something solid before I said a word. And then I told her the rest of it, the part that was harder to say. I told her I had also been afraid of getting it wrong. Afraid of being the grandfather who reaches in and takes something away and turns out to be wrong about it. Afraid of the look she was giving me right at that moment, sitting on that porch. She was quiet for a little while longer after that. Then she reached over and put her hand on top of mine. "You waited until you were sure," she said, "and then you were there. That was enough." That was more than enough. That was 8 months ago. The FBI investigation is ongoing. I can't say more than that. Dorothy Hensley has since filed a formal statement. There may be other families out there that we haven't found yet. These things move at their own pace, but they do move. Claire went back to work in August. She picked up running again, something she had given up after her mother passed. On Sunday evenings, she still calls. We talk about her caseload at the hospital, about Eugene's latest project in Knoxville, about how the leaves have been coming in along the Tennessee River. We don't talk about Colton Reeves very often. When we do, she handles it the way people handle something serious they've come through. Not pretending it was small, not letting it be the thing that defines her either. If there's anything in this story that's useful to anyone, I'll keep it simple. Charm is not the same as character. A person can perform warmth, perform devotion, perform the whole picture of a future together, and do it well enough that even people who love you can't see through it. What they can't keep performing over time is consistency. The details drift. The story shifts in small ways that don't seem like much until you write them all down and look at the shape of them. If something feels off, check it. A business registration is public record, takes 10 minutes online. A professional license is one phone call to the state licensing board. A property claim can be searched at any land records office. These are not dramatic steps. They are the same due diligence you would do before signing a business contract. There is no reason someone who wants to marry into your family should receive less scrutiny than a business partner. Get your documents in order. Trust, will, shareholder agreement, whatever applies to your situation. Don't wait for a crisis to wish you had done it sooner. And when you find something wrong, don't carry it alone any longer than you have to. I told myself holding it was caution. Some of it was just fear. The same fear that keeps a lot of people quiet when they shouldn't be. The fear of being the one who breaks something. You're not breaking something. You're stopping it from being broken. That is a completely different thing. Eugene understood that immediately. He came to me in that lodge with what he had found because he trusted that I would listen and I would act. That matters more to me than I can really put into words. Claire understood it on that porch before the coffee was even finished. I'm 66 years old. I've built things and lost things and built them again. The $90 million trust is real and it matters, and I worked hard for it. But it is not the most important thing I will leave behind. The most important thing is simpler than that. It's Sunday evenings. It's Eugene sitting beside me in the lantern light and leaning close because he knew I would listen. It's Claire's hand on mine by the river. That is what we protect. Everything else is just paperwork. A con man doesn't steal your money first. He steals your trust, and then your money walks out the door on its own. If this story made you think of someone you care about, share it. It might be the most important thing they read this week.